Thank you so much, Teresa. Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are so glad you're able to join us today. My name is Patrick Green, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Engaged Learning, Teaching, and Scholarship. But let me be clear, I really work for Susan. And so I'm going to let Susan introduce herself.
Thank you, everyone. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Engaged Learning, Teaching, and Scholarship. I manage up Patrick Green, but I also have the pleasure of running University Service Learning Program in our office's faculty development programs. I want to thank you all for coming out today. So we're going to be talking sort of specifically about community-based learning and community-based research, but introducing the concept of something that we call the idea of how public things, which is sort of actually a particular idea, can influence the way that we think about these bigger questions about sort of who is a community member who gets consulted around these questions. And it's based off an article that Patrick and I recently had published. And at some point in time, Patrick, if I could trouble you to throw that into the chat, that would be great so that folks have access to that. Things that I will say, this is very much a work in progress. So we're going to be talking a little bit of how some questions that we personally had around the work raised and got us thinking. I'll be talking about how I applied a level of educational philosophical theory to this that sort of gave a new insight that I thought made me think about and consider the work a little bit differently. And then Patrick and I developed the very, very beginnings of a potential methodology for how to approach this. It is not set in stone. It is not field tested and approved by 5 dentists. So if as this is very much sort of an exploration and a chat as well. So we would actually love to hear your feedback, especially when we get to that section of the presentation. If this echoes something that perhaps exists in your own field, please let us know about it. If this you believe that we're missing sort of an essential and important step. We're really interested in talking about this methodology in groups and circles of folks who are concerned about community-based learning because we want to see if there's potential attraction there. And as well, we're just hoping to see what happens when we look at things a little bit differently. What happens when we start these questions from a different place, which is exactly what we sort of are, I believe that public things can do to some of these questions. But I'm going to start by sharing a PowerPoint that we'll be referring to, but I've got a couple of focus questions I want to share with us. And then actually pretty shortly after that, we're going to go into small groups to give folks a chance to kind of get their creative juices and questions flowing around those. But first, I'll share the PowerPoint. Patrick, anything I missed in these openings at all?
No, thank you for that framing. And if I could ask people, as Susan is setting up the PowerPoint, please feel free to put your name and associations, organizations that you're associated with, roles, positions, if you are so interested and inclined, in the chat box as well. And then when you go into the breakout rooms, please be sure to introduce yourself to your colleagues as well, so that you're creating spaces where you're networking with each other as well. But with that, Susan, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Great. So again, the topic of this is considering power in community-based research, shifting towards a public work for public things framework. And these are our focus questions. So would love, and I'll make sure that I drop these into the chat before you guys go off into breakout rooms, but we'd love for you all to take some time to think about and talk through who qualifies as a community member when it comes to community-based research. And I would also add community-based learning onto that as well. How are they identified? Which community members get to set research questions or agendas? So again, this question of who qualifies as a community member? Is it, a zip code, an area of residence? Is it length of time? Is it particular membership? How are they identified? How do we recognize that? What does that look like? And which community members get to set research questions or agendas? Now, if this is an area that you're particularly interested in and know a great deal about, I imagine you'll probably have a lot to say. If this is something that's a little bit newer for you, I would say take a stab, take a guess. What have you seen? If you've seen community-based research or heard about initiatives, did you get a sense of how those decisions were made? Or on some of these, would your response be, I don't know how they're identified. That process seems really opaque, actually. I think that's just as important. So again, those are our focus questions. I'm going to stop our share. So those questions are in the chat for you all again as well. And we'll open up some breakout rooms, and we'll have probably just under 10 minutes to introduce yourselves and sort of talk through these big questions about who gets identified in communities and who gets to set research questions and tones. All right, welcome back, everybody. I hope your conversation was edifying and you were able to connect with some folks. We'd love to just sort of open up and get some reactions to some of these questions. So yeah, reactions, thoughts, who qualifies as a community member when it comes to community-based research? What do you think about those decisions? How are they made? What have you seen? If you're gun shy to unmic, you can also feel free to put something in the chat, but we're a smallish group, so I would encourage you to give us a sense of what you're thinking about.
Yasmin and I had a good conversation. She's from Curl. I'm with a community-based organization and a former Loyola. Patrick, it's always great to see you. We just had I don't think we got into all the questions. We really were talking about how it's important to be,
that's great,
for what we're doing, very broad and trying to catch as many community members when we define a community as possible. I'm not a researcher, so I don't know exactly, but that was just to get the conversation started. We talked a lot about that.
Yeah. Sean, I'm curious, when you talk about, trying to catch as many community members as possible, where are some of the challenges in terms of maybe as you think about who might not get captured? Like, how do you deal with that, or how do you address that?
Yeah, and we work with K-8 we work with K-12 populations. And so we were also discussing, we obviously focus differently depending on which program we may be working with or what's going on. But we have a in-school program at Sullivan High School right now. And part of that came from a collaboration with Loyola in that certain English language learning students were completely getting missed in even English language learning directed programs. They were not being defined as part of that community. And so it's definitely challenging. And I think it's also, we've experienced a lot of challenges with Chicago public schools when students are either suspended or off of the CPS system. They stop attending school. It is extremely difficult to catch them and capture them as a member of the community. And it takes a lot of really hard grassroots efforts with community partners, and just sometimes just going and actually texting students and be like, hey, I need you to talk to friends and really get down in the weeds to realize that the system sometimes miss those people.
Thanks so much for sharing. That's really also, too, again, like an incredible dedication to make sure to surface those voices.
I can jump in. And I have to say, I hope when I grow up, I get to work for Sean Conley. So I'm glad that's on the record now. I'm Stacy from the Quinlan School of Business, Department of Marketing. And similar to what Sean was talking about, I had mentioned in my small group that with Mary and Meredith, yes, we're there. Just that from a marketing perspective, we oftentimes, our whole goal is to understand consumers' unmet needs, but we get so tied down into one target market that we fail to look at these edge users or extreme users that we might otherwise think are outliers, and we have nothing really to learn from them. And yet, if we could get more comfortable with a sample size of one or a smaller sample, we might be able to really take some of the edge cases. And so, Sean, what you guys spoke to reminds me in some way of that. So thank you for initiating the chat here.
And Stacey, I'll be very curious to see what you think about the framework, particularly when it comes to questions of use, right? Because so public things sort of brings up a conversation around use when it comes to community that sort of other frameworks sometimes don't. So maybe sort of one last sort of broader reaction question. Which community members get to set research questions or agendas? What do you all think about that? What have you seen, for good or for ill? Or do community members get to set research questions at all? I think that could also be an important question.
I've got plenty to say, but I don't think you want somebody from Curl talking, because this is what we do 24/7. So I'll look at everybody and say, somebody else jump in. Mary, I think you unmuted.
I was going to say that people who have access to power or resources tend to be the ones who set the research questions.
Yeah.
Places like Curl, which are unique, can help community members shape the research questions to meet their needs. But a lot of other places have a more directive approach and determine, so the researchers determine what the research questions are. And that's often problematic.
Yeah. Very often, usually researchers have determined research questions even before community sort of comes into it, right? So they'll claim they're doing community-based research, but the question's already been set and settled. If the community sort of had any viewpoint in shaping that at all. Any other thoughts on that? Patrick, anything else you want to chime in before we pop back over?
Yeah, so I will just share that in addition to what Mary said, even when I have found myself through the service learning courses that I teach or the community-based research courses that I teach, working with community members, it often is through a nonprofit organization, and I'm finding myself working with the staff or administration of that nonprofit organization rather than the community members and or the clientele that is connected with that organization. So as opposed to the example that Sean gave at the beginning, working with students and families in Chicago public schools, those are great examples of members of the community. Oftentimes when we're also working with the community, we may be working with administration or staff of a nonprofit organization, which then begs the question of, are they members of the community? Like if a geographic community of the local community, or are they representatives and figureheads of a community and not necessarily representative and or voices of the larger community? And so I just wanted to share that because I think that's inherent in some of the questions that Susan has shared, but also leads itself to the framework that we're going to be sharing with you. So I'll turn it back to you, Susan.
Actually,
All
can
right.
I just respond to that?
Of course.
This gets at the first question we discussed, who's a community member, and sort of in a general sense, it's the individuals and organizations that, and it's usually within a geographic area, but it can be obviously virtual communities as well. But then there are a lot of other stakeholders, and you can choose to, whether you're going to define those as part of the community as well or not. But the stakeholders often have can have a political agenda that is not helpful to especially to the individual community members. They may or may not be beneficial to the organizational members of a community. So it gets complicated.
Absolutely. All right, so we're going to jump back into the slides here, and this is going to be a little bit of a, I apologize, we'll make sure to take some breaks for conversation, but there's going to be a little bit of information sharing on this. So, but Patrick's going to make sure to be monitoring the chat. So as ideas or comments come up, please, we'll make sure to sort of stop for those conversations. So Rogers Park, a case study. We write fairly extensively about Rogers Park in our article. And that is because the experiences both of doing community-based learning and research influenced sort of a lot of these questions that came up. I'm also a Rogers Park resident. When I moved to the city 10 years ago, I moved to Rogers Park and I never left. I'm a proud mortgage holder in the neighborhood and the community as well. But for folks who live in Rogers Park, you know this, for folks who are familiar with the neighborhood, it's a very diverse community. It's a very unique community. There was an article that came out not too long ago from the Tribune that talked about Rogers Park, where the weird survive, right? Where we see this really interesting and dynamic intersection of a variety of different folks who have been here historically, a variety of different refugee communities who have been resettled, a variety of different income levels. And I think the last metric I heard on average was that there are over sort of 7 different really common languages in Rogers Park. Sullivan High School is one of the most diverse in terms of offerings of language opportunities because so many of the students are either refugees or don't have English as their first language. So we're looking at a very, very diverse community. And so doing community-based research has looked and made us really think dynamically. And as Patrick pointed out, we work with quite a few community partners, but many of them are providing services to folks in Rogers Park who aren't necessarily residents themselves, which has made us really try to sort of think hard about sort of what those relationships look like. On top of that, in some cases, more and more, the agency might be centered in Rogers Park, but the ones who are running it aren't from Rogers Park, and folks who are coming to get the services themselves might not actually be from Rogers Park as well, but it's a staple of the Rogers Park community. On top of that, what happens when community interests come into conflict with one another, when the groups want different things or prioritize different things or different considerations? Look at any of the neighborhood Facebook pages to see a really thriving and very active difference of opinions around a variety of different things. Any comment directed towards our alderwoman, you'll see a lot of different community interests and needs. And what I found is we were sort of looking at a variety of different frames and approaches, is some of these traditional perspectives in terms of looking at community development or community-based engagement didn't really have or provide enough breathing space for negotiating conflicting needs. So asset-based community development, a very vulnerable and well-established theory. We went to a training, and when I pressed about sort of what do we do when we see different elements and aspects of the community in conflict, the response that kept coming back to us was this sort of like, well, then you just haven't talked to enough people in the community, because if you talk to enough of them, then you'll sort of eventually find like the true community whose actual interests are being surfaced, which sort of didn't sit well with me. And so we really started to grapple with what do you do, right, when needs are in conflict, but also how do you know who gets to decide who's a community member? Patrick, other things to add to this slide before I move forward?
No, I think you actually stated it really well, but I think going back to some of the points even that Mary suggested a few minutes ago, how are we defining community? Who gets to decide who the community and who community members are? And then of course, it's complicated with stakeholders, but here we're really raising the question around community members and who gets to define community and who gets to decide who community members are, as Susan said.
Yeah. Because I think, especially in a place like Chicago, it raises the question of, is length of time, right? Very often you'll see someone claiming, like 3 generations of my family have been in this neighborhood. Or is it utilization of services? So back to that question about like, if you have someone who's utilizing services based out of an agency that's in a particular area or community and using them very heavily, but they themselves are living in a different neighborhood, does that mean that they aren't part of this community, even though a significant amount of their time and maybe to a certain extent the resources and needs are coming from an area? So again, all these questions coming up. One of the things that we address in the article, and we're not going to spend too much time on this element or aspect, is the idea of being able to define community engagement as public work. And that's coming from some of the thought of Harry Boyd specifically. And this is definitely a conversation, I think, in community engagement work in some areas. And that's this idea that sort of what happens when we redefine the work of a university around community engagement as this idea of public work, right? So we're not setting the agenda as much. This is meant to be part of this broader conversation that is more dynamic. Again, a self-organized effort of a mix of people who are creating things that at the core is rooted in deliberation. So in an attempt to decenter power, a lot of places have said, okay, when we approach our community engagement work, we're doing public work. We're meant to be in conversation. We're meant to not be the only voice at the table. We want to make sure, again, that no one, again, singular sort of power holder is controlling the entire conversation, which I think is a very admirable and really great way to sort of think about destabilizing power, particularly if you're coming from a university perspective. But because deliberation is at the core of that, it really begs the question, whose voices are getting surfaced, right? So when we're thinking about public discourse, how does that guarantee that neighborhood needs are being addressed? How are we potentially losing some of these voices? And how do we provide opportunities to make sure that some of these voices emerge, particularly when they might be, again, like not as evident, a little harder to recognize, or they're just questions already about, are they quote unquote a member of the community or not? Patrick, anything else to add on there?
Another way of framing the question, or series of questions that Susan just stated, are how are we guaranteeing the neighborhood's priorities are elevated? And so really then questioning whose other priorities are being situated and elevated, and how do we make sure that the neighborhood, the people living in the space that we're identifying as the community, that those priorities are voiced and elevated. I'll turn it back to you, Susan.
And when you have a number of those voices and they're in conflict, what do you do? And so that's why I, wanted to introduce the concept of public things, and how the idea of starting not from a like, okay, how do we make a decision on sort of who gets to speak first? But rather starting literally from a place of place might change the conversation, or might have us sort of like think differently or potentially surface different things. So public things is a term that comes specifically from the work of Bonnie Honig. She is a political philosopher. This is coming from a book that she wrote in 2017, riffing off a little bit of Hannah Arendt's work if you really want to dig deep into the weeds, but I would recommend starting with Bonnie Honig. And so a public thing, and again, this is different from a space or a place, a public thing is something that is the object of a public sort of shared value and care. So it is something that is somehow publicly accessible in some form. They typically are sites of contention, but they're also sites of coalescence. So they're places and spaces and things that sort of bring people together, become a flashpoint of community use, utilization, or conversation. They're very often publicly held, but they can also be private as well. And I'll double back to that in just a second. And some examples are schools, libraries, public transit, swimming pools, churches, parks, businesses, roads. These things, right, that seem to be the point and place where communities come together. Another frame that she used is the chances are, if there's been a protest around usage or access to it, you're looking at a public thing. She specifically writes about payphones and the role of payphones, how they sort of both like came in and out of vogue, but the impact and effect that they had specifically in New York City after one of the major storms sort of caused a huge and massive power outage. But she talks about the fact that what is it about these things and places where the way that people utilize them, the way that they become these flashpoints for community conversations, right? That they bring folks together. There's usually a lot of conversations about sort of who gets to use and utilize them. So I think when it comes to, again, things like swimming pools, libraries, schools, that conception of a public thing can be sort of easy to access, but they can also at times be private spaces. I actually write specifically about Devon Market in my article. So that's an example of a privately held business, but it's one that a lot of the folks in the neighborhood have a great deal of opinions about. There are, I think, an element and aspect of community that is formed. And it's a place inside of contention. I write specifically about sort of what happened when folks were, when construction was starting on the Target that's now off of Sheridan. And a lot of folks immediately went to, what is this going to do to Devon Market, right? What is this going to do to this privately held business? But it became a point of contention and concern for the community and began to surface a lot of these needs.
Susan, can I jump in really quick?
Absolutely.
Susan and I did a lot of dialogue around public things, and Susan, as a philosophy of education expert, this is really her area that she has done some research in. And I think, Susan, one of my questions is, can you continue to explain how public things transcends geographic location, but does not
Yes.
ignore geographic
Yeah.
location.
So, and I think that's the interesting piece, right? Is it's because when Patrick and I were writing this article, he would often sort of say public spaces, and I'd be like, no, it's a public thing. It's a very particular thing. So public things are physical. They're physical objects, right? And so they're connected to a spot and space. But what we're looking at is specifically sort of how this thing, right? So it might be a church building. It might be, for instance, what the building that was sort of formerly St. Ignatius's Rectory, now formerly sort of the old building used by the Waldorf School, now is an area that I think is still sort of being contended around use. That would be a great example of a public thing. It's a flashpoint for conversation. It's been a space and place where communities have come together and have a lot of opinions about sort of usage. So it's more than just a building, right? It is a space in which we see people sort of interacting and utilizing it. The CTA is another great example of a public thing, right? It is both a thing that operates in our life, but it also does a great deal to sort of bring up conversations. It's a flashpoint for political dialogue and discourse, and it makes people think about sort of their community and the shape of it. Sort of riffing off that, so Bonnie Honig specifically says that public things are a necessary, although not sufficient, condition for a healthy democracy, because they become these places that concentrate and focus citizens' attentions and galvanize their efforts. And I've certainly seen that in particular through some of the community-based learning and service learning that our students have done, where sometimes very apolitical students would not feel maybe necessarily sort of comfortable saying, oh, I'm not political, I don't do political action. But when it comes to either talking about Chicago public schools or accessibility to the train, all of a sudden they're very comfortable advocating for that. That's a space where they're very comfortable, again, exerting or taking political action. But if you were to talk to them, maybe specifically, they'd be like, oh, I'm not a political person. But this public thing that they recognize as a necessary sort of part and element of the community becomes a galvanizing force. And again, this great line from Honig: public things constitute us, complement us, limit us, thwart us, interpolate us into democratic citizenship, right? And again, I think it's a historical example, but access to swimming pools, particularly during the civil rights movement, was a great example of a public thing. Who gets to use them? Why, when, and how? What does that usage look like? Patrick, other thoughts around that, or did I help sort of clarify that?
No, I was simply going to say, I put in the chat other examples of public things that maybe our colleagues on this Zoom meeting might have in mind, because again, I think, as Susan has described it so eloquently, it goes beyond a public space. And she's given us some great examples in the both in the literature, drawing from Honig's work, but then also other examples specific to Rogers Park. And I also want to share, Stacy put in a really great point in the chat. Stacy raised the question of how third spaces fit in here. We often talk in terms of, as a scholar practitioner or practitioner scholar, as individuals who have a foot in multiple spaces, we often identify as third space professionals. We are not just one thing or one professional identity, but we are in the blurred spaces between multiple roles and multiple identities. And I think that's such a great connection that Stacy's making, Susan, that I would love for you to respond to, is how are public things in some ways third spaces, because they serve multiple purposes.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think this is another great example, right, of this is both, I think, a very helpful term, but also can be a little, can admittedly sometimes sort of be like, okay, well, am I looking at a building or am I looking at a public thing? And the answer to that would be, how are people using it? How are people utilizing it? And how do they feel about it, most importantly? And so I think that's that interesting dynamic of it. It could be really easy to say, well, okay, well, every publicly held space is a public thing. Unfortunately, maybe not necessarily, right? There might be a number of parks in which people sort of have a strong amount of disinterest in, right? But the ones that people are become flashpoints of interest, or people invest a great deal of time in or have a great deal of opinions about us, are a good example of that. The third space element, and I think Devon Market is a good example of that, you can have privately held spaces, especially businesses, I think are a good example of this, that are public things because of the way that people feel about them, the impact that they have on communities, and most importantly, the ways they become sites and sources of discourse. I talked about Devon Market. Another example that I might give for folks who have ever lived in or visited in the Bay Area, Berkeley Bowl is a grocery store. It's a publicly held grocery store. It is absolutely a public thing because of the way that people identify with its usage, identify as a user of Berkeley Bowl, advocate, have changed city licenses for it to operate. Things can become public things because of the ways that people come together to take action specifically, or come together to hash out opinions, to surface conflict around them. I hope that helps a little bit. So another way, just, and I think that a frame that might be helpful is when we look at a public thing, especially when it comes to the context of community, we're not asking who are we, right? That conversation of like who gets to be considered a community member. But public things sort of asks us what needs our care and concern, right? So you can definitely typically spot a public thing when you see a place that people have concern or care about, and the ways in which it activates and animates folks. I think can be really important. I talked a little bit about this before, but there are often ways that apolitical individuals can be drawn into advocacy, especially around usage. I talked about a little bit before, but we have students who, for instance, their interactions with the CTA might primarily be, you know, this is how I get to school, this is how I get to certain entertaining establishments in Wrigleyville, and that's about it. Community-based learning might cause them to start utilizing the CTA in different ways. They might start having conversations with folks sort of specifically about their usage of the CTA who live in different elements and areas and neighborhoods of the city. And so suddenly it's through the CTA that their understanding of what it is to be a Chicagoan starts to expand. And as they become more and more aware of it, they might also become more and more aware of gaps in usage and gaps of availability. And that might become a place in which they become comfortable becoming political, right? In ways that they may not have before. And the other piece as well, and I think this is helpful to think, especially from the perspective of folks who are at universities doing community-based learning, is that public things have a level of permanence, right? Our students leave in 4 years. Many of our staff also leave as well. The CTA persists. You know, a public school is typically in that spot and location for an extended period of time. And in fact, when it's not, it becomes a heavy flashpoint, right, for political action and discourse. So the ways in which public things sort of persist beyond some of our own human activity is also important to think about as well. Patrick, other thoughts in there?
No, I think you captured it well. And I put in the chat again, reframing the necessary questions. And the focus here is what needs our care and concern when you're looking at public things. So thanks for emphasizing that.
So we're focusing again less on like whose opinion is right, and starting from a place of where does it seem like people are being gathered? Where does it seem that a lot of folks have care, concern, or interest in a particular area? What are folks using, and how do we start from there? Before we get into a conversation about elicitations of concerns, I want to pop up for a second and see if we've got some comments, because I know that this might be sort of a new concept for folks, or you might say, all right, I think you're just talking about school building. So what are thoughts, questions, points of interest around this concept of public things?
Not to always talk first, but this is super interesting. And I was just going to say, so I also work with the Roger Park Business Alliance and the Edgewater Chamber of Commerce. I'm actually the board chair for the Edgewater Chamber, because that's where we are. And, you know, a lot of these concepts come up as well whenever we have people get really, it feels like a public space, even when we talk about blocks of streets, particular business districts, which are meshed with residential districts. Like people care very passionately about how we're looking at branding Broadway without even necessarily the core components of the businesses in there. You see neighbors coming up. We just had a zoning fight on Broadway about the height of a building. I mean, I think there's so much here. I just think that it's eliciting a lot of reaction. I think this is super fascinating, Susan. This is super duper interesting.
And I think it's that dynamic, right? Because I think that frame of like, oh, this is a public space, it's publicly funded, you know, like that's a piece where to a certain extent, like we can kind of see and understand, but that breathing space that allows for that idea that like, no, people can feel very passionately about a particular block, right? Like people can feel, another great example, and it's a little focused, but in the city of New Orleans, there is an old design, particularly of the sewer grates, right? Of old classical design that people feel very strongly about. It's featured on jewelry. It's a part of sort of very much the marketing. When the city of New Orleans started replacing some of those grates with a cheaper, older model, people came up into arms, right? Because this was both part of their identity, a part of their understanding. But their care and concern for sort of this is how our city looks. This is a way that we define ourselves. The carpet in the Portland airport, I'll try to put a link to a podcast in here, is yet another example of specifically a public thing. And I know that sounds a little bit strange, but there are a huge group of people for whom the experience of a pattern on carpet defines and impacts how they understand themselves. And they've also taken political action around it. And so it's all these ways in which I think care and concern start to surface, but then they also become places and spaces in which we start seeing elements of usage that brings voices forward that we might not otherwise have heard. Other thoughts around sort of public things? All right, and I'll also throw a link into, if you're curious to kind of dig more specifically into that concept as well. The book by Honig, where she really digs into this, is called Public Things, Democracy and Disrepair. That might be helpful as well. And she's a great thinker whose reading is very accessible. That's why I appreciate her so much. All right, Patrick, I'm going to flip it, go back to sharing the slides and flip it to you, if that sounds all right.
That sounds great. So as we were digging in some of these philosophical conversations and dialogue, we also wanted to bring it to a practical level of, well, how would you actually do this? If we want to really prioritize the voices of community members and engage with community through public things, how would you do that? And so as Susan and I discussed this, we actually went back and we interrogated our own practice. We interrogated the community-based research courses that we teach through our center at Loyola. And we looked at all the promising practices that we do. And those promising practices that the literature says, if you're going to teach this service learning course, if you're going to do community-based research, this is what you need to do. You need to sit down with a community partner and you need to ask them what research questions and ideas they have, and you need to develop the research question together. And we interrogated, we really dug into how we were doing that with our community partners in the courses that we were teaching. And we started to really question some of these promising practices, because it goes back to what we talked about at the very beginning. We were getting the administrator of a nonprofit organization's perspective and the research question, and they definitely co-constructed the research projects with us, but we were not necessarily getting the voices of community members and the priorities of community members. So Susan and I constructed then through this inquiry, utilizing our practice and our experience and interrogating our practice and our experience, we constructed the elicitation of concerns. And this methodology is done at and through public things. God bless you, Susan.
Thank you.
So I wanted to, again, root the approach of public things, as Susan has just talked about for the past few minutes. And as the slides, as it says in that second bullet point there, going to a public thing. So first identifying public thing or public things, listening, and communicating with those utilizing it, utilizing the public things. That's how we're suggesting an emergence, the emergent concerns of community members may arise. And it is through that public thing, this observation of how it is used and by whom, that we are trying to suggest we can get closer to the priorities of the community members. So this methodology, we have some very specific suggestions, but before I get to the suggestions for the practice of this methodology, Susan, what else would you add about the elicitation of concerns?
Yeah, I think it's just to sort of say this is us very much sort of beginning a way of approaching things. And so not only is it a matter of sort of going to the public thing and sort of both talking to folks both about their usage of the thing, but then also allowing like, what else is on your mind? What are you thinking about? I think recognizing a public thing's ability and capacity to sort of be utilized by a group of different people. So there's a strong kind of component of emergence in there, but also really paying attention to sort of how it is being used specifically. An example that gets brought up in the article is, so let's say you're doing something specifically around literacy in a neighborhood, right? You can take the perspective of working directly with a nonprofit who has all of the data on hand about sort of literacy deficits and the need for that. But another way to sort of surface some of this could be going to a local library, both talking to people about their usage of it, listening to concerns, but just paying attention to sort of who's utilizing it. Are you seeing a lot of families using sort of it becoming a place that's important for sort of a story time hour? Does it become sort of the de facto meetup spot for a local running group? Are you seeing a lot of groups of teenagers sort of pouring over the graphic novel section? Because when that happens, you might see other people and other groups whose voices you wouldn't have necessarily sort of directly recognized, talked to, surfaced before. This might be an opportunity to both hear their voice, but also approach it from a different perspective. It allows, for instance, that same conversation about literacy, right? If you start from a public things perspective and utilize the library, you might still come to a conversation where you say, okay, Rogers Park really values the importance of sort of literacy and engagement, but that's because look at all the ways in which people are utilizing this library, that it becomes very valuable and important, essential to them. So you're starting from a desire-based place, to quote the language of Eve Talk, rather than just a deficit deficit-based framework as well.
And I think I would add that much as people may use art or music or poetry, writing as a medium to create dialogue, that the public thing becomes both a thing in and of itself and a medium through which community members and their voices and their priorities, their concerns are communicated. Yeah. So I really appreciate, Susan, how you described, both observing how people are interacting with the public thing, but also, and what else is on your mind.
Yeah. And again, going back to sort of Devon Market, right, and the concern and care about what would happen to Devon Market when sort of the target arrived in Rogers Park. If we dig a little deeper into some of those concerns, what you heard from people was both is some of the character being washed out of our neighborhood, right? Other folks might specifically, have articulated this is a space where I know I can be guaranteed to get particular foods or items that are very important to me, either from an ethnic perspective or religious perspective. Are those going to go away if this business closes? Which would mean that perhaps there's not a space for me in the same way that there was as well. And so kind of looking at folks' reactions to and care and concern for the public thing that was Devon Market, in many ways surfaced some concerns about a whitewashing of a neighborhood, right? That may not have come up if we have just to have said, okay, who's interested in sort of community development? All right, and Patrick, I'll flip back to you as we talk kind of specifically about what some of these steps look like.
All right. So, and we're going to share again in the spirit of wanting to provide some practical steps that one could take to engage in this emergent methodology of elicitation of concerns. First, identifying the public things within the context of the community. Then generating questions specific to the public thing for the elicitation process. So that public thing becomes in and of itself central, but then also the questions emerging from, as Susan said, perhaps how that public thing is being utilized, observing that, as well as other questions to elevate the community member's voice. If already engaged with additional community partners, of course, this process should be shared with them as well. So generating those questions with community partners. These questions are not to be seen as exhaustive or prescriptive of inquiry that occurs during the elicitation of concerns. So sometimes follow-up questions might emerge as well. And so allowing for questions, emergent questions or organically emergent questions to be fostered as well. And then developing an action plan to actually employ those questions and the elicitation of concerns is really important. How are you going to go about with the community partners, with community members? How are you going to go about engaging the public things and the community members? And if you could go to that next slide, I think there's one more.
Mm-hmm.
During the elicitation of concerns, participants obviously need to practice critical listening and observation. So other than raising the questions, really listening to what the members are saying, are sharing, and allowing for emergent themes to arise as individuals interact and speak with each other. So thinking of terms of conversation starting, not conversation dictating, right? So starting conversations, but then listening to how others respond and talk in collaboration. And that this observation is meant to be both participatory and engaged so that the observer's own interactions with the public thing is very much recognized. How are you interacting with the public thing as a participant? So Susan, if we could, let me stop there. Is there anything you would add to that description of the elicitation of concerns?
No, I don't think so. I think you nailed it.
So before we go to the next slide, let me just get reactions from the participants of this call. What are your reactions to this methodology? As Susan said, this is an emergent methodology. And so I would welcome you to share questions, reactions. What part makes sense? What part do you say that's bunk? No, I don't buy it. We welcome all of that.
Yeah. And I readily admit I'm a philosopher. So, you know, if you're like, this is too esoteric, nice thoughts, but no utilization on there.
Well, I will be. I'm curious to see, you know, in practice how this works.
Yeah.
As you're having these conversations, I'm, you know, of course, thinking about our 26 years worth of community-based participatory research and thinking about how to situate this. So, from my perspective, do say more. I'm curious.
Well, and I think some of it, David, is it's one of those where all of this really started from me sitting in that asset-based community development session and sort of saying, yeah, but what happens when people don't agree? Because folks kept telling me, if you just keep like talking to folks, eventually you'll come to this one common focus that is the focus and need of the community, and that's what you do, right? And I had my own experience of, I live in a really diverse neighborhood where people don't agree on things. And so depending upon who you're talking to, then are you looking at, do communities just keep subdividing down and down and down? So then the community of, you know, Syrian refugees in Rogers Park is the only place from which we can start, versus this larger conversation about, to a certain extent, it's a broader conversation about democracy. Are we going to be able to move forward only if we sort of focus on one group's needs at a time? Or is there a way and space where we can find, and it still might be very complex, but these common spaces? And I think this is where Honig's work around public things and democracy gets really interesting. That there are these common concerns, that there are these places in which communities come together where they can share sort of common interests and concerns, that become a starting place for us to build community, that become a starting place for us to ask about community needs. And it's not pretty and it's not clear, but it becomes, I think, a little bit more inclusive than just the like, well, we just need to keep subdividing down to figure out what the Italian American residents of Rogers Park who have lived here for over 25 plus years think should happen to the community. You know, like that to a certain extent could be an asset-based community development perspective when it comes to community needs. And going to a public thing, a place that people care about and people utilize, and paying attention to like who's showing up that we've never talked to before, right? Because of the ways that public things bring people out and together. What are the ways in which there's a commonality of usage or care and concern? What are the ways in which these, opinions vastly shift and differ, right? The conversations around school resource offices in Sullivan, I think, is a great example. You had a lot of parents there who really, really wanted to get rid of the school resource officers. You had a lot of students who had some very strong and well thought opinions about it. And then you had this whole block of refugee parents who were like, no, I want my kids safe. I want that officer there. And it's a complicated conversation. And if you're just looking at groups, it's going to seem like we're never going to find a way to sort of talk about this. But if you treat the school as a public thing and start paying attention to sort of how it's used and who's there and whose opinions are coming forward, we just start surfacing things, right? And then I think it becomes a jumping off point.
Other questions or responses to the elicitation of concerns?
I think that's really exciting. I think there's two things that I'm thinking about. One is, so we, and I feel out of my depth talking to all of you very smart people, much smarter than me as just a community practitioner. So excuse me if I use the wrong
just a
language
community practitioner. How dare you, Sean? No, take that out. We're going to edit that recording.
In two places. One is, in this was back in kind of the last 10 years that I've been working in the Rogers Park, Edgewater neighborhood. I have observed, I think we're finally starting to change. I think this goes along with that, where you would go to meetings about different things, but it was always the same. Okay, well, we're all represented because all of the 7 of us who come to the 3 o'clock in the afternoon meeting are at the table getting paid to be here from our organizations. And that was always a real concern. It really didn't matter where we were in the community. And so I love that, using the public space and actually looking at who's using it, remembering that every resident is not in the block club. And that does not represent necessarily, that's it, that we got their letter, so we're good to go with every resident on that street. I think that's a part of this. But then the other thing that comes through for me is we usually bring our high school students in Chicago are the ones who are actually doing, they're generating their own projects. They're generating what they want to do within some of our different programming spaces. And so we always show up at meetings with them because they're the actual people who are doing things. And that usually is very unsettling to sometimes. We've worked with other, maybe more like, I guess, institutional or older school partners where it's like, well, we don't need to hear this voice. And I feel like this really helps give us another opportunity to give a platform to be like, everyone using it, including, I don't know. I just really like how this feels. I guess democratization is right, Susan. I certainly see that. I don't know how this is the first time I've ever heard of it. This is really super duper exciting to me, at least as somebody who's seen a lot of challenges in getting the real who's using the space. What do we mean when we talk about neighbors or students or any group? I think this is just super duper exciting.
Yeah. No, and I think, Sean, you hit right on it, right? Like, I think sometimes when we take a step back, particularly in diverse communities, and just say, who's using this, right? Both one, are we surfacing voices that we aren't hearing, or are we noticing like there's a whole demographic that's not using this space? So what does that mean and why? And is there a question there? And I think on the flip side, we can like, I love my neighborhood. I love my neighborhood. Again, I will point to the Facebook groups and the comments and the opinions and the strength of them. people have a lot of feelings about a lot of things, particularly in Rogers Park, and I'm sure it's true of other neighborhoods as well. And I wonder if it reorients rather than dismissing, right? Because a lot of people could have looked at that conversation around Devon Market and be like, why, like, it's a supermarket. It's not even a big one, you know, like, what is going on here? But when you dig down into what's happening with that public thing, you start surfacing other concerns, right? So what was like, I don't know if I want this mini Target here because it might threaten my neighborhood, slightly larger than average, you know, local market. What we start digging into is, are we whitewashing a neighborhood? Right. The conversation in New Orleans about the nature of who gets this old historic design for a sewer cap was actually fundamentally a conversation about sort of like, whose neighborhoods are we reinvesting in? Who are we recognizing as having historic value? Whose neighborhoods are places that we want to see tourists go to? Which is also a very strong conversation around race. And that was a conversation that was elicited by a lot of people having a lot of opinions about the shape and design of a manhole cover, right? Which could easily have been dismissed, but upon digging in, you start seeing all these different layers.
I see that Robert has his hand up.
Just real quickly, just terrific session, by the way. The elicitation of concerns. I'd like to hear a little bit about for those who are, you know, gathering the meeting, who are eliciting concerns, about how you formulated questions that allowed people to elicit concerns.
Yeah. So, and again, this is very much a methodology that sort of is in progress, but I think some of it would start with, because you're starting from the public thing rather than the issue or sort of the meeting topic, you would sort of say, okay, what is the public thing or space I'm going to? So if it's, I'm going to the Granville CTA stop, right? I would start with some questions first around like both usage of the CTA, but then also things about the stop. So maybe like, what do you like about the stop? Is it convenient? What would you change? And sort of honing in there. And then, but beyond that, really sort of, I think, allowing for some emergent questions. So some might be like, what else is a concern for you? Like, you know, so when someone says, oh, I use this to commute to work, great. How long is your commute? Where do you go? You know, what are some issues that you have? Or, you know, oh, I use this stop because I go to the Armory specifically for some fitness classes. Great. You'll tell me more a little bit about that. And how long have you been using that? So it's a lot of sort of an emergent frame. It's meant to sort of jump off and pay attention to conversations about use and interest. But you'd start from that perspective of, so rather than asking folks who are coming off the train, you know, like, what do you care about? It would start with like, why are you here? Why are you using this stop? What do you think about it? Do you feel safe at this stop? Do you really enjoy the new mural? You know, but from there, you might start seeing all of these different sort of lines of flight for interest.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And I would add to Susan's comments, again, the goal being allowing community members to express what needs our care and concern, and to address that core question through the public thing of what needs our care and concern. And so I think it might be helpful now, Susan, can we go to that last slide?
Sure, absolutely. Just a second.
It's the very last slide, and I think it continues this conversation of, as David said, how does this work in practice? And kind of building off of the question that Robert just asked, you know, so this elicitation of concerns, how does this work? How do you actually gather some of those questions? And if we, as Susan and I interrogated our course and our practice, we went back and said, all right, how could we, what would we do to apply this framework? So Susan, are you able to share? We just have one more slide where we're going to talk about how we would actually apply the framework the next time we teach this course.
There we go.
Thank you. And so the first thing that we're going to do is we want to let you know that we plan to apply this when we teach our community-based research course. And we want to demonstrate how this impacts not only the practice of collaborative research, but also how this impacts the design of teaching and learning, because the elicitation of concerns as a methodology is actually a new way of communicating with both the community, but also it's a new way of being with public things. So we want to really see how does this influence not only the practice of collaborative research, but also how we construct the teaching and learning, and obviously how this informs our understanding of who has voice in the community. Again, as we interrogated our practice, we found ourselves doing a good job of following the most promising practices, but of collaborative research, but found ourselves working often with administration of a nonprofit organization, which, as Susan said at the beginning, may or may not have been living in the local community or part of the community and communities that we were focusing our attention on. And so we hope to apply this to our practice, and in the process, really kind of explore where this elicitation of concerns and this focus on the public things framework will shape not only the course and our teaching and learning, but also shape our understanding of who has voice in the community and how people have voice in the community. Susan, what would you add to that?
No, I think you've nailed it, Patrick. And I think some of it is, for us, we have an understanding of this is not meant to replace, to say this is the only way to do community-based learning or research. I think it just speaks to, this might be another way to, I think from my perspective, when I know that I'm dealing with a diverse community, ask questions about like, what might I be missing? What other voices can we lift up? What else might be sort of on the peripheral of my mine and my community partners' attention? But it's certainly meant to be another way to supplement, not necessarily, and now this is the way that you apply or do this. So the course that Patrick's talking about specifically, we were asked by a local school, a local private school, to do some research into sort of how current families thought about how diverse the environment was, what work they needed. And we interviewed families, we interviewed teachers there and staff, but we never really asked, and here's the school that draws some local students, and that was part of their desire, was how do we get more folks in the local community to take an interest in potentially attending this school. We never really talked to anyone outside of that. And what would have it looked like if we had sort of taken a step back and even started with the school building was based out of an old church that was also utilized by other groups. And so what would have happened if we had just started kind of looking at what other groups are using that space, and how does an awareness of that school play into that? What would have happened if we had popped down to the next closest L stop and sort of asked, who was coming through? If nothing else, we could have at least, surfaced, hey, when we look at the difference between sort of the identities, care, and concern of the folks who are at the next closest major L stop, none of them are being reflected in your school students. How would that have changed the conversation? And I think we want to, when appropriate, sort of bring that into our own work.
So with that in mind, again, we want to open it up simply for questions, challenges, or final thoughts regarding the public things framework and the elicitation of concerns.
I have a quick question, comment. So first off, thank you. This is a really interesting way to really think about this in a fashion that I know at Curl we have in certain ways, but I just really like the framing and thinking about public things, and I'm going to check out that book. So my question is, Susan and Patrick, could you dive in a little bit more about practically like how you're hoping, like, you know, we've got this course, we have these students, like, are you literally sending them to LSTOPs? Like what is your, I'm kind of curious of what you're hoping is going to look like next.
Yeah, so some of that is a little bit of a moving feast. We always have a community partner that we're working with in terms of community-based research. And also, like, I think there's an element where we really enjoy sort of working in an interdisciplinary frame. Stacy, who was on the course, we've worked with her before, and I think there's a really interesting intersection between the market research element of use and public things. And I think that's a space, place that if there's bandwidth, we'd love to open up. But some of it might be, when our community partners identified this course is typically taught in the spring for next year, the community-based research course in particular, they identify their question. We talk about and make a plan. I think if there's a space in place, we want to make sure, can we at least on a smaller scale think about, is there a public thing that's connected with this? So using the example of the school before, right? You know, is there a nearby public thing that we can include in this if it's not sort of evident or apparent? On the flip side, right, maybe we end up working with Sean, and you know, when there's this concern about what's coming up with this nearby block renovations, I think there's a really great opportunity there to start asking folks like, why do you have so many opinions about this particular block in Edgewater, right? You know, like what does that look like? And so instead of starting from sort of that this particular agenda, just really beginning to like, seems like you have a lot of thoughts about that. Tell me more about why you care about that. Or seems like you really, really care passionately about the fact that, you know, we should not have buildings that go above 6 stories along this corridor. Tell me more. What's it mean to you? What does that look like? So I think pragmatically, it's going to depend a little bit upon who we work for, and it might be a big piece of it. It might be just a small scale. We want to make sure we think about, is there an intersection between here and a public thing? Or we might find that there is a major sort of flashpoint around a public thing, like for instance, the old St. Ignatius Rectory, right? That a lot of folks have a lot of opinions about usage and where that should go. That could become a really interesting jumping off point directly for where that could go.
And I would add to what Susan said, Teresa, in response to your question, because we frame the elicitation of concerns as a methodology, we very much want to explore how this is a way of being and doing with the community. And so, as Susan said, you know, it could be something that we do based on the partner and the question, you know, extensively, or it might be something that we have to do partially, right, with the students and the partner, all depending on the project. But because one of our goals in all of our community engaged learning courses is to immerse students in and with the community and to connect them to the community, I think Susan's point about really identifying public things and then having students engaged with the public things is certainly going to be one way that we approach how we want to immerse them in the community. So I think that obviously there are lots of different ways to do this work. And I think one of the reasons why Susan and I are excited about the public things framework is it's another point of entry to respectfully and honorably work with and enter communities.
And I think the other flip is in the same way that